In the year 1988, a remarkable black physician on the verge of discovering a breakthrough in cancer treatment disappeared from his laboratory. Authorities, swayed by a competing corporation, labeled him unstable and claimed he deserted his family. For a decade, this falsehood was the only narrative, and his contributions were wiped from the medical records. Then, an unprecedented heat wave triggered a chemical spill at the abandoned site, uncovering a concealed vault and a secret that had survived for 10 years. Before I share the full story, thank you for tuning in. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It truly means a great deal to feel your presence. We are united in this experience. Now, here is the truth. In 1988, within one of the most esteemed medical research institutions, Dr. David Morgan was on the brink of offering humanity an immeasurable gift. At 39 years old, he was a man of quiet genius, a pediatric cancer specialist whose gentle nature masked an unwavering and intense moral resolve. His work transcended a mere profession. It was a profound mission, a personal battle against one of the most merciless diseases. For 3 years, he had dedicated himself relentlessly in his modest laboratory at the Ashcraft Children's Cancer Research Center, supported by a mosaic of university funding and charitable contributions. His research focused on a rare orchid native to the depths of the Amazon rainforest, a plant whose chemical elements were esteemed in indigenous healing traditions for their potential to sustain life. After countless hours of meticulous effort, David Morgan had isolated a compound that revealed results nothing short of extraordinary. In preliminary tests on pediatric brain tissue samples, the compound did more than just halt tumor growth. It caused a remarkable portion of the cancer cells to self-destruct, all without the harsh and harmful side effects commonly associated with traditional chemotherapy. The treatment was gentle, precise, and incredibly hopeful. News of this breakthrough, published in a modest but respected oncology journal, quickly attracted attention. It reached Verexon Labs, a pharmaceutical powerhouse known for its aggressive acquisitions and major profits. David was invited to their sleek corporate headquarters, a towering structure of steel and glass that seemed to overshadow the humble brick buildings of the Ashcraft Center. The meeting took place in a boardroom on the highest floor, offering a sweeping view of the city below. Sitting across a large polished table was Dr. Robert Keller, Verexon's chief scientific officer and a former member of Ashcraft's board. His smile was a carefully crafted tool of influence. "David, this is exceptional work," Keller said smoothly and fatherly, motioning for him to take a seat. "Truly groundbreaking. We've been following your publications for months. The precision of your mechanism is the kind of refined science that emerges once every generation, and at Verexon, we want to be the ones to bring it to the world." He slid a substantial leather-bound folder across the table. It was an offer for licensing, a document filled with astonishing figures, patent agreements, and provisions that would grant Verex exclusive and unbreakable control over the compound. David Morgan glanced at the folder but did not reach for it. "Thank you, Robert," he said, his tone steady yet resolute. "I appreciate the gesture, but my work is not something I am willing to sell." Robert Keller chuckled softly, a low sound of seasoned knowing. "David, do not be so quick to judge. This is not just a matter of money. Although, to be clear, the sums in that folder would make you exceedingly wealthy. This is about legacy. Imagine it. The Morgan compound, your name forever linked to the patent. A Nobel Prize is not out of reach. We possess the resources and the means to transform you into a legend. The only legacy I care about is a world where more people survive," David replied, his expression steady. "My work has been financed by public grants. Robert, this has been nonprofit work at a nonprofit institution. The compound is not mine to own, nor is it for Verex. It belongs to the public." Keller's smile tightened, revealing the first hint of a fissure in his otherwise charming demeanor. "The public does not have a billion-dollar research and development pipeline, David. The public lacks a worldwide distribution system. You have a promising molecule. We can develop it into a medicine. You want to conduct open-source trials? Go ahead. The National Institutes of Health moves slowly and is bogged down by bureaucracy. You will be overwhelmed with paperwork for 5 years before you can treat even one patient. We can fast-track this and have it ready for use within 18 months. Isn't that what matters? To save lives as quickly as possible." It was a convincing and tempting argument. The appeal to his own honorable purpose, but David recognized the hidden danger in it. At what expense, Robert? A cost so exorbitant that only the wealthy can afford it? A decade-long exclusive patent that blocks any further independent studies? No, the information will be shared openly with universities, research hospitals, and even our rivals. The sooner everyone collaborates, the sooner we can perfect this, make it better, and get it to every child who needs it, not just those with the right coverage. The air in the room seemed to cool by 20 degrees Celsius. Keller's facade of friendly guidance vanished, exposing the ruthless nature of a predator. He leaned in, his tone shedding its warmth and taking on a low, menacing edge. That is a noble but terribly naive outlook, David. You are sitting on a molecule worth billions. You do not simply give it away. That is not how the world operates. You may be a brilliant scientist, but you are a poor businessman. In this world, the businessmen decide what is produced. That is how my world functions, David replied, rising with resolute finality in his voice. I regret wasting your time. He left the boardroom, the leather-bound door closing behind him. The folder along with the future it symbolized lay untouched on the desk. He did not notice the cold, deliberate anger in Robert Keller's eyes as he observed him leave. Several days later, David Morgan went to the Ashcraft Center on a Saturday afternoon to collect the final tissue samples needed for the upcoming stage of his research. He assured his wife, Althea, that he would return before dinner. However, he never made it home. When he failed to respond to his pager, a panicked Althea contacted the police. 2 officers arrived at her residence, their faces showing a blend of boredom and impatience. She conveyed to them how vital her husband's work was, and shared her deep, gut-wrenching fear that something dreadful had occurred. They took her statement with a weary, patronizing attitude. The following morning, the lead detective received a discreet and serious phone call from a highly regarded individual, Dr. Robert Keller of Orexin Labs. Keller expressed his profound respect for David Morgan, but noted that David had recently been under tremendous professional stress. He had become erratic, consumed by his research, and was making unrealistic and inflated claims. Keller feared that David, in his fragile state, might have simply abandoned everything. The call was a subtle, official character assassination that shaped the entire narrative. When Althea called the station once again, the detective's demeanor shifted. His tone no longer dismissive, it became soothing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with false compassion. "We are investigating the situation, but you must realize it is not unusual for a man under intense pressure to need some time apart. He is likely to appear in a few days once he has calmed down." Her cries and her firm belief that her husband would never desert her and their son Kareem were dismissed as the outbursts of an overly emotional wife. Unable to face reality, in just a few months, the official narrative was established. Orexin Labs, praised by the financial media for their acquisition of the parent company of the Ashcraft Center, announced the shutdown of the struggling facility, citing overlapping operations. Dr. David Morgan, the gifted oncologist, was officially pronounced missing, presumably overwhelmed by the demands of his own brilliance and abandoning his family. His name was quietly removed from the NIH trial records. The world moved on. Yet his wife and son did not. The decade that followed became a slow, grueling ordeal of sorrow and injustice. For Althea Morgan, the world transformed into a dull, colorless place. The bright moments she shared with David faded into the background because of his absence. The official explanation that her capable, moral, and devoted husband had simply left was a never-healing wound, a constant, painful slap in the face from a system that refused to hear her. She refused to let his memory vanish. Her resistance took the form of a quiet, solitary, and unyielding ritual. In the spring of 1998, marking the 10th anniversary, following his disappearance, she stepped into the same downtown police station. The air carried the familiar scent of old coffee and disinfectant, exactly as she recalled from 10 years ago. The desk sergeant was a fresh face, young and impatient, sporting a thick mustache and a tired expression. "Can I assist you?" he inquired without glancing up from his paperwork. "Yes," David Morgan said, her tone calm and rehearsed. "I am here to submit a missing persons report, an update for an ongoing case." The sergeant exhaled, finally raising his eyes. He recognized her from the previous year, the woman obsessed with a decade-old unresolved case. "Ma'am, we have been through this. The case is closed. There are no new leads." "I am aware," he stated. David's composure held firm against his dismissive attitude. Yet he remains missing and I am still his spouse. Therefore, I will file this report. She slid a photograph across the counter. It showed Robert Keller smiling, captured on their last anniversary. His full name is Dr. Robert Morgan. He stands 5 feet 11 inches tall, has black hair and brown eyes. The last time he was seen, he wore a gray suit and had a leather briefcase in hand. The sergeant accepted the photo, his face revealing a mix of pity and irritation. "Look, Mrs. Morgan," he said, his tone softening with a hollow sympathy she had learned to hate. "Isn't it time to let this go? It has been 10 years. He is not coming back. You must move forward with your life." David met his gaze firmly, her eyes unwavering. Unwavering when the person you cherish the most in the world is taken away from you. "Detective, you do not move forward. You cling. You cling to the truth even when nobody else will. Now, will you accept my report or must I talk to your superior?" The sergeant, defeated by her steadfast determination, sighed and produced a new form. The yearly report was her declaration. It was her way of telling the world and reminding herself that he was not forgotten. He was missing, not gone. For their son, Kareem, his father's disappearance was the pivotal moment of his existence. He was 20 years old when David Morgan disappeared. A brilliant, idealistic college student. The man he idolized, the gentle giant who had inspired him to embrace science and to always challenge authority, was taken away from him. His legacy stained by a careless, harmful falsehood. The injustice of it ignited a fire within him. He switched his focus from pre-med to pre-law. His father had been a healer. Kareem decided to become a warrior. In 1998, at 30 years old, he was a law student at Georgetown, spending his evenings not at bars, but within the quiet, vast halls of the university library. He was surrounded by piles of legal books and boxes filled with documents obtained through years of Freedom of Information Act requests. It was a solitary, trying quest, a battle fought amid dusty archives and microfiche readers. He was examining a collection of heavily censored papers. The documents were connected to the corporate merger between Verickson and the parent company of Ashcraftoft. Most of the information was useless, with entire pages obscured by thick, insulting black lines. Yet Kareem was his father's son. He was thorough, patient, and unyielding. He was not merely reading the text. He was analyzing the redactions themselves, searching for any discernible patterns. One late night, beneath the faint green light of a library lamp, he discovered something on a page about the shutdown of unnecessary research divisions. A single line had been clumsily redacted. The black bar was slightly off, exposing a few letters above and below it. Kareem leaned in closer, his heart beginning to race. He could make out a phrase, an acronym, a PH protocol. It meant nothing to him at that moment, but it was something. It was a solid clue, a fragment of language salvaged from a vast sea of black ink. He carefully copied it onto a fresh legal pad, circling the term repeatedly. EP protocol. This was the first genuine breadcrumb he had uncovered in 10 years of searching. Although he did not yet understand its meaning, he knew it was a thread he had to follow until the entire conspiracy came apart. He became certain that David Morgan had not simply disappeared. He had been intentionally erased. The police had failed them. The system had let them down. Kareem understood that if the truth was ever to surface, he would have to uncover it himself. For a decade, he chipped away at the wall of silence, armed with his law books and driven by the memory of his father. The summer of 1998 arrived in Georgia like an intense fever. A heat wave without precedent gripped the state for several weeks, causing the asphalt to soften and the air to turn into a thick, shimmering haze. The power grid struggled under the load while air conditioning units began to fail, leaving the city of Atlanta sweltering beneath an unyielding, brutal sun. This natural phenomenon unexpectedly set in motion the exposure of a decade-old unnatural crime. The abandoned Ashcraftoft Children's Cancer Research Center, a site long ignored by the city, started to leak. Its decrepit cooling systems, overwhelmed by the extreme temperatures, eventually broke down completely. Within the building's underground levels, pipes ruptured, releasing a slow trickle of black chemical waste. This toxic liquid seeped into the earth, spreading along the easiest paths into the storm drains that served the nearby residential neighborhoods. After several days, reports began to pour in. Locals in a nearby area complained of an unusual oily black sludge backing up into their gutters, killing the grass on their lawns and filling the air with a subtle chemical odor. The city dispatched David Morgan, a mid-tier environmental technician, to look into the matter. David was a modest man, hard-working but largely unnoticed, accustomed to handling routine city maintenance tasks like clearing sewer clogs, addressing unlawful dumping, and investigating strange odors. This complaint appeared no different. He initiated his inquiry in the affected neighborhood, tracing the black sludge from the storm drains back towards its origin. His search led him to a chain-link fence nearby. The fence enclosed the vast, neglected campus of the former Ashcraft-Oft facility. He devoted nearly an entire day tracking the origin of the leak within the deserted building. The site was in ruins, reflecting a hurried evacuation. Torn papers lay scattered across the office floors. Empty coffee cups, dried and forgotten, rested on desks, while a thick coat of dust blanketed everything. By following a trail of faint, outdated schematics, he located the leaking water's path leading to a complicated network of pipes descending into the basement. The air inside the basement was chilly and damp. He trailed a large, insulated refrigerant line down a concrete hallway to a part of the building that did not appear on the original blueprints. This area was a sealed laboratory wing, its entrance obstructed by a heavy, rust-covered steel hatch embedded in the floor, resembling a bunker entry. An aged, stenciled sign above it read, Unit 4C Expired Trials Clearance Revoked. Using a crowbar from his truck, David Morgan managed to force the rusty hatch open. He climbed down a set of steel stairs into a dim, waterlogged corridor. Here, thick black sludge reached ankle height. At the far end of this passageway, a single sealed door made of thick, reinforced glass, similar to a bank vault, awaited. The control panel beside it showed a small green light softly humming, the only indication that the lifeless building still held some activity. The door's glass was coated in a dense layer of condensation. Yet through the fog, David could make out something distinct. Fingerprints smudged on the inner side of the glass. His heartbeat quickened. He cleared a round patch on the fogged glass using the sleeve of his work shirt. Peering inside, he found a man staring back at him. The man's complexion was pallid and skeletal, his eyes wide and empty. He was alive. The revelation of a man trapped in the vault quickly turned into an extraordinary and gripping local news event. David Morgan was in his modest apartment preparing for the bar exam when he caught the story on the evening broadcast. The reporter stood before the familiar crumbling brick exterior of the Ashcraft-Oft Center. When the correspondent mentioned the man was discovered inside a sealed experimental research section, a sudden chill ran through David. He immediately reached out to his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with an emotion he could not quite define. "Turn on the news at once. I believe they have found him." The rescue unfolded as a tense, almost unreal endeavor. Paramedics teamed up with a highly trained hazmat crew, carefully negotiating their way down the waterlogged corridor. They succeeded in bypassing the electronically locked vault door. As it opened, a blast of frigid air swept out, heavy with the scent of ozone and antiseptics. Inside lay the man, swiftly transported to a secure intensive care unit in a prominent hospital in Atlanta. He was severely emaciated, his skin pale and almost see-through with extensive frostbite damage. Though alive, he was barely holding on. The case soon became a perplexing enigma both medically and legally. Who was this man? How had he ended up there? How was survival even possible? The identification plaque outside the vault offered the first unsettling hint. The report stated, "Patient 41 Bravo is unresponsive. The nutrient cycle failed 71 days ago." As the man lay motionless in his hospital bed, connected to a network of advanced life support machines, Detective Harding from the Atlanta Police Department began the process of identifying him. A DNA sample was immediately sent to the State Forensic Laboratory. The results returned in under 24 hours. The DNA perfectly matched a missing persons record from over 10 years ago. A case that had been updated annually by a devoted wife in mourning. The man was Dr. David Morgan, who had vanished 10 years prior and had been legally pronounced dead for 7. Altha and Kareem arrived at the hospital, emotions swirling with a mixture of dread and hope. A doctor greeted them in a small private waiting area. "He is alive," the doctor affirmed, his voice carrying a sense of professional amazement. "We do not understand how." The chamber where he was found appears to be an early version of a metabolic suspension device intended for long-term human trial preservation. Although the main nutrient cycle stopped functioning, a secondary cryogenic cooling mechanism stayed operational. This forced his body into a state akin to hibernation, drastically slowing his metabolism to an almost imperceptible rate. That is the sole reason he remains alive. Another few weeks, and even that would have failed. Altha was granted permission to enter the ICU room first. She stood beside the bed, her hand covering her mouth, tears cascading down her cheeks. The man lying there was a gaunt stranger, a pale shadow of the lively, affectionate husband she had lost. Yet it was undeniably him. She felt it deeply in her heart. She reached out and gently touched his hand. His skin felt cold and fragile, like thin paper. His eyes, previously shut, fluttered open slowly. They appeared cloudy and far away, yet they fixed on her face. A brief spark of recognition, of memory, of love, bridged the long, frozen stretch of the past 10 years. He attempted to speak, his voice a dry, worn rasp. Silent tears slipped down his sunken cheeks. "They locked me in," he whispered, uttering his first words in a decade. 2 days later, the official statement was delivered amid a media storm. The press conference was conducted, not by law enforcement, but by Verickson Labs, accompanied by a city representative. An impeccably dressed lawyer spoke on their behalf. Verickson Labs expresses deep sorrow and shock over the discovery at the abandoned Ashcraft-Oft facility, said the lawyer, his expression serious and composed. Though we acquired Ashcraft-Oft's parent company 10 years ago, all activities at that location had ceased before the merger. It seems there was a tragic industrial mishap where a former scientist, Dr. David Morgan, inadvertently entrapped himself inside an experimental chamber during site deactivation. We vow full assistance to authorities and offer heartfelt condolences to the Morgan family. Kareem and Althea watched the announcement on a small hospital waiting room television. Althea just shook her head, a quiet tear marking her cheek. Kareem's sorrow was colder and more intense. "Listen to them," he whispered, his voice a low, bitter growl. "They are not even attempting to be subtle. A neglected facility mishap. They are constructing a legal barrier. They are distancing themselves from the site, from the timeline, from him." David Morgan looked at his mother, his gaze steeled with a newfound determination. They believe they can bury him once more, this time beneath a mountain of falsehoods. Yet they are mistaken. They made a single error. They left behind a witness. The investigation that ensued was a silent, relentless battle waged not on the streets, but within hospital rooms, law firms, and the recollections of those who were compensated to forget. While the world celebrated a medical miracle, Kareem Monroe and a few committed officials discerned the outlines of a monstrous corporate scheme. David, his strength gradually returning, began to speak. His account, given in a faint, hushed voice to a state investigator, became the crucial element. He recounted his final day. He had traveled to Ashcraft-Oft to collect his samples. Upon arriving at his laboratory, he was confronted by Dr. Robert Keller and 2 security guards. Keller informed him of a minor contamination problem and insisted he undergo a routine decontamination process. This was a fabrication. The coffee they offered him was laced with drugs. He recalled a wave of dizziness, a strange, heavy numbness creeping through his body. He remembered being strapped to a stretcher, the ceiling tiles blurring overhead in the corridor. He remembered being placed into the cold, sterile vault. His final conscious thought was a fleeting image of Keller's face, an expression not of hatred but of icy detachment. The situation was driven by clinical necessity. He awoke in the darkness, a tube inserted into his arm. The soft buzzing of the machine was his only companion. He had been given a new identity, marked by a plastic bracelet on his wrist that read Patient 41B. He was enrolled in a trial to which he had never agreed. The program's name flashed briefly on a monitor before the door sealed shut. AF Ethics Preservation Hold. The objective was unmistakable: to silence him, without involving complicated legal issues that would arise from ending his life. He was no longer a patient. He had become intellectual property, trapped in a legal void. With his father supplying the what, David Morgan, applying his legal expertise, started to uncover the how. His inquiry targeted former Ashcraft-Oft employees. Most could remember nothing, their recollections wiped away by generous severance deals and strict non-disclosure agreements. But David was relentless. After several weeks of combing through old employment files, he finally located her, a retired nurse named Brenda, who had worked in the records department at Ashcraft-Oft before it shut down. She lived in a small town 2 hours away from Atlanta. David arranged to meet her at a quiet coffee shop tucked away off the highway. Brenda was a woman in her late 60s with gentle yet frightened eyes. Her hands shook so uncontrollably she struggled to lift her cup of tea. "I do not know why you are talking to me," she whispered softly. "I only worked in records. I don't have any information." "I believe you do, Brenda," David said softly, his tone steady and comforting. "I am not here to cause you any trouble. My reason for being here is that my father, Dr. David Morgan, spent 10 years confined in a room within that building, and I need to find out the explanation behind it." Brenda visibly recoiled at the mention of that name. "She said they told us Unit 4C was intended for long-term equipment testing," repeating the official company statement. "They claimed the noises were nothing but simulator sounds." "You knew that was not the truth, did you?" Kareem leaned in, pressing her further. "Did you hear something?" The woman finally lost her composure. Tears began streaming down her cheeks. She whispered that she once heard a man's voice, her tone breaking, a faint moan that sounded like someone suffering. "I reported it to my supervisor, but he insisted I was mistaken. He said it was merely a test dummy with a motion mechanism. Then he warned me that if I mentioned it again, I risked losing my pension and that Verickson had excellent lawyers. I had a family to take care of. I was terrified." "I understand," Kareem said gently, his voice full of sincere sympathy. "But you are no longer afraid, are you, Brenda? You have come here." She looked back at him, her eyes holding the weight of 10 years of guilt. "I couldn't bear it any longer, not after I saw his face on the news. He was real." She reached into her purse, trembling, and pulled out a thick manila envelope which she slid across the table. "I made copies of these before I was let go. I'm not sure why, but my conscience would not allow me to discard them. I was too scared to ever act on them." Kareem opened the envelope, revealing memos that served as undeniable evidence. The phrases were cold and detached corporate jargon for an abduction. Trial 41B. The subject resisted intellectual property acquisition. Return on investment was negative. One read, signed by Robert Keller. Activate EP protocol. Erase while preserving. Do not revive without sealed approval. The missing piece of the puzzle fell into place when Kareem, consulting his father's notes, conducted a comparison. Verickson Laboratories' latest blockbuster chemotherapy drug, Verixatil, which was generating billions, had a molecular structure that matched 89% of his father's gentle, non-toxic formula. However, the minor modifications Verickson implemented to obtain a new patent made it significantly more toxic, causing harsh side effects. The conspiracy was fully exposed. They had not only silenced his father but had also stolen his life's work, corrupted it for financial gain, and left him locked away in a cold storage unit, a phantom trapped in a glass coffin, while innocent children suffered outside. His awakening was never intended. The discovery of the truth did not bring about immediate or honorable justice. Instead, it triggered a drawn-out, cynical, and ultimately successful concealment, orchestrated by a battalion of expensive corporate lawyers. The nurse who blew the whistle faced intense attacks on her testimony, with her trustworthiness questioned. The internal memos were dismissed as unverified papers of dubious origin. Dr. Robert Keller, now the celebrated chief scientific officer of Erickson, fell silent, shielded by a legal team that deflected every attempt at investigation. He released a single brief statement conveying his deepest condolences for the unfortunate events. The incident that had occurred involving his former colleague lingered in David Morgan's mind. The other directors from Ashcraftoft had long since dispersed. One of them had died years ago from an alleged overdose. Another had escaped abroad to a country without an extradition agreement. Officially, the investigation had gone nowhere. The legal deadline for kidnapping charges had run out. Kareem Monroe, now a certified lawyer, arranged a meeting with the district attorney, a slick and ambitious politician named Reynolds. Sitting in Reynolds's vast office with the city skyline shining behind him, Reynolds said, "This is a remarkable tale, Mr. Monroe, a genuine victory of the human spirit, and you have my deepest condolences." Kareem responded bluntly, "I am not seeking pity, Mr. Reynolds. I want an indictment. I provided your team with the memos, my father's testimony, the nurse's report, and the chemical lab results from Rexel. This is a plot involving kidnapping, false imprisonment, and large-scale theft of intellectual property." Reynolds exhaled deeply, a rehearsed air of regret. "May I call you Kareem? Your father's testimony, after a decade of harsh confinement and forced hibernation, would be dismantled in court. The memos have a questionable chain of custody. The nurse is a resentful former employee. Verickson would drag us and your family through endless litigation that we cannot risk losing. The statute of limitations on kidnapping has expired. Proving intent would be a challenge. Regarding the other accusations, it is a legal quagmire. You will not be filing charges, Karim declared firmly. It was not posed as a question. I officially refuse to press criminal charges due to insufficient admissible evidence to achieve a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, Reynolds explained, his words a perfectly polished legal defense. I am sorry, son. My hands are tied. Once again, the system had shielded its own. David Morgan, his body still weakened and his voice barely audible, delivered a single powerful public address from the hospital steps upon being discharged. He stood supported by Altha and Karim, facing the crowd of news cameras, his eyes clear and resolute. I was never unstable, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I was inconvenient. My research threatened a business model that profits from illness. So they did not argue with me. They did not attempt to refute my science. They erased me. They held me cold until they believed the world and my family would forget me. They were mistaken. His statement ignited a brief storm, a tale of remarkable endurance and corporate corruption that held the nation's focus for several weeks, before fading as all such accounts inevitably do in the relentless spin of the 24-hour news cycle. The vault itself, the cold clinical chamber, was removed from the closed hospital and taken over by a university medical ethics program, standing silently as a haunting tribute to a crime that went unpunished. The following years were marked by a silent and challenging ordeal. David Morgan never truly healed. He spent his remaining time enveloped in the tender and devoted care of his loved ones. A man displaced by time, perpetually tormented by those dark years. Robert Keller, now a distinguished civil rights lawyer, dedicated significant effort to bring his father's work to light. Eventually, he succeeded in retrieving a damaged zip drive from the vault's internal archives, a faint echo of his father's research notes. Much later, an enthusiastic and talented medical student conducting her doctoral dissertation discovered fragments of the data Robert had shared online. She referenced the remnants of Dr. Morgan's research in her study on non-toxic cancer treatments. This marked the first instance his name was cited in scholarly literature since 1988. Though faint, his legacy had been revived, much like himself, in a subtle whisper. The closing scene is not a grand legal triumph. Instead, it shows a child in a sterile hospital room flinching as a nurse administers an extremely harmful and costly chemotherapy treatment that earned Verick's labs enormous profits. This child will never learn the identity of the man who endeavored to ease their suffering. The man who was silenced to protect corporate gain. The fight against cancer remains unresolved. One evening, several months following his release, David sat alongside Althea and Robert in the tranquil warmth of their living room, watching the sunset dye the sky with shades of orange and purple. Though still fragile and wrapped in a heavy blanket, his eyes held clarity and peace. You know, he whispered softly, his voice rough and low. The hardest part, the most unbearable part of everything, was not the cold, nor was it the darkness. He glanced at Karim, then at Altha, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sorrow. It was the knowledge that the children were still out there, the very ones I was trying to protect. I would lie in the darkness and see their faces in my mind. I understood that while I was frozen, they continued to grow ill. They were still being loaded with the toxins I was striving to replace. He drew a trembling breath. Then it struck me. The true evil was revealed. They did not just take my life from me. They took my work and twisted it. They seized something pure and gentle and carefully re-engineered it. They made it just different enough to secure a patent and dangerously toxic enough to suit their business agenda. They are not merely selling a remedy. They are selling the illness it accompanies. The real tragedy is not that they buried me. It is that they buried my research and are now offering the world a golden forgery in its place. Karim reached out and rested his hand on his father's shoulder. But they have not won. Dad, you are here. We hold the truth. David Morgan looked at his son, then at his wife, two people who had refused to let his memory fade. A faint, sorrowful smile appeared on his lips. Yes, he murmured. We have the truth. It was the only justice that would ever exist,